Hello! So this is a follow-up to the first video on home electrification that I just released on the main channel. I want to talk about a couple of things that I left out of the script, which I now regret. So I took them out for a good reason, mainly to shorten the video, and I'll get into the inside baseball on why I do that sometimes, but in this case I really shouldn't have. And then secondly, I want to tell you why you're not going to hear me push you to install rooftop solar. I actually have some strong reservations about doing that because the way we do it now is not sustainable, and to make it sustainable probably will ruin the value of doing that. So yeah, we'll talk about that later. First, what did I leave out of the script? All right, the heat's coming on. This is Connextras. I don't care. The first thing that I left out of the script was what the process of getting a service upgrade is like. And the reason I regret this is because a couple of my patrons have commented, well, if you're going to replace the electrical panel, why don't you just get a service upgrade when you're doing that? Great question, fair point. And relatedly, I don't want to paint the span panel or smart breaker panels in general as the only solutions here. That's why part 2 is happening. But even then, there are some even simpler solutions that we could potentially explore. But the issue with a service upgrade is the thing that caps you at 100 amp service is not just the main breaker on your service panel, it's the wires that go from your panel to the power transformer, wherever that is. And so when you want a service upgrade, those wires have to get replaced. And that's something that your utility has to do, or with the help of an electrician. It's usually, it varies depending on where you are. But what does not vary is if the wires that go into your house can only support 100 amp service, they need to be changed to get you up to 200 amp service. And that might be fairly easy if your power comes in from a mast. You just have to run new wires from your mast head over to the transformer or utility pole, whatever. But if your power is trenched to your home, like it is for many people, then you got to dig a new trench, pull out the old wires. It's not exactly an easy thing. And so that's why a solution which can say, hey, you don't need to upgrade your service so long as you just keep everything in your home from exceeding 80 amps sustained, 100 amps peak, that could be really helpful. And another consideration besides cost, and this is just speculation on my part, is your neighborhood might be tapped out, and the utility might say, you know, with the lines that we have going through your neighborhood, we have too many people that are already signed up for 200 amp service. We can't upgrade you to 100 amps. And that is another reason, relatedly, to try to use these energy management solutions, because if we can, to borrow a phrase, flatten the curve, then the neighborhood infrastructure doesn't have to deal with so many homes that might be pulling 150 amps for an hour every evening. If the max that anyone is pulling is only 80 amps, that also diminishes the work that needs to be done to upgrade the grid in that local area. So there's a lot of reasons why it's really helpful to, rather than just upgrade your service to 200 amps and be able to pull 140, 150 on the rare occasions you need to do that, it would be better to just say, let's just cap it at 80 and, you know, find some way to do that. And there's tons of ways to do that. One example, this is actually a perfect situation right here because the water heater and the dryer are right next to each other in the basement here. So they don't need their own circuits. If I just had a device that said, okay, either the water heater has power or the dryer has power, they could share that circuit. So there's a great example. If I run the dryer, even if I'm doing a ton of laundry and I'm using the dryer constantly for 4 hours, it's fine to delay the water heater from recharging the tank. If I'm even using water at all, or someone else in the house were using water, they can still use the water. So stuff like that. There's tons of solutions there. I'm rambling, as I tend to do on this channel, but that's the big thing about an upgrade to 200 amp service. It's hard. It may be very expensive. It might not be possible. And so rather than requiring everybody to do that, a way to sidestep that issue is really helpful for tons of reasons. All right, and the other thing that I deliberately took out of the script and now kind of sort of regret, but not as much, was why we're in this situation in the first place. Because it is perfectly rational to still be using natural gas in a lot of places. The reason we have natural gas infrastructure in the first place is that it is power generation historically is not that thermally efficient. If you burn natural gas in a power plant, at best you're going to get about half the energy out of it into electricity. By the time you account for other losses, you're maybe at 40% efficiency. But if you just bring that gas into your home, you can get double that efficiency on even the cheapest furnace or boiler, and even you can chase those diminishing returns, and there are some furnaces which will get the vast majority, like 98% of the heat energy into your home, which is really good. And it was perfectly rational to do that when the only way we could make electricity was by burning a fuel. So it's not like there's no rhyme or reason to this. And in a lot of places, it is still more efficient to burn gas than it is to generate power, except when you consider heat pumps. So that's kind of the reason why I took it out of the script, because as I talked in my heat pump videos, at least from a resources used perspective, if you burn natural gas in a power plant and run a heat pump with a COP of 2.5, which these days they can pretty much all achieve down to at least like 17 Fahrenheit or 10 Fahrenheit, and soon even colder than that, then it no longer makes any sense to burn natural gas locally from a resources used perspective. Cost can be different, and that's why I wasn't getting into that. And then you can also eliminate the risk of leaks by taking out that infrastructure. And if you stop relying on gas, just everything starts to get a little bit more sustainable. But yes, it is definitely the case that it is not irrational to be burning natural gas. And so that's why there's tons of housing all over the place that uses natural gas. And especially if you have natural gas rather than propane or fuel oil or something else, that's why, like in the Chicago area, it is super common for people to have gas everything. We have gas dryers because the cost of that fuel per kilowatt hour is cheaper than electricity. So that's just why we are in the situation we're in. It was perfectly rational when the only way we could make electricity was by burning a fuel. But now that we have many other ways to do that, including renewables and nuclear, we really ought to stop relying on natural gas. So I took out that section just because it's like, that was then, this is now. We're looking forward, we're not looking into the past. And I've talked about it in the past, but just to be clear, you shouldn't necessarily feel awful or guilty for still relying on gas. I still do, because cold climate heat pumps are really hard to get around here, and nobody installs them because people just like, well, what's the point of that? Like in the example of my parents' home, they absolutely should have a heat pump. When their home was built, it was deliberately going to be all electric. So who cares if a heat pump doesn't work that well below 25 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever, because every day it's better than that, it would save energy to have a heat pump. Or every day it's warmer than that. So that's just, it's one of those frustrating things, because around here, reliance on electricity alone is pretty rare. HVAC contractors just don't think about heat pumps, even when they're absolutely advantageous. So yay! Right, so then the last thing that I want to talk about is the inside baseball of like, why did I remove this from the script? Basically, in case you haven't noticed, my scripts tend to get pretty long because I really like to peel apart issues and talk to, explain the reasoning behind them. But for this particular topic, I have already covered why burning natural gas was pretty rational in the past. I think I already mentioned, but I don't remember how I'm editing this because I'm doing this off the cuff. I have a video, a pretty old one, on why burning natural gas is more resource efficient. So I didn't go into that because it's one of those things where you don't need to hear the same story again and again and again. It gets tiring. At this point, most of us are on the same page that we need to move away from fossil fuels because not only are they harmful for reasons I hope we're all on the same page about, but it costs money to extract them, and if we have to keep extracting them forever, that's expensive. That's why renewables are so cheap, because you build the thing and then, oh, the energy is free aside from maintenance costs. So what we have to deal with is how can we store that energy efficiently and cheaply, which is what we're working on now. But, you know, it should not be rocket surgery to figure out that you can build a solar farm or a wind farm, and then guess what? Yeah, you spent some money and extraction to build that stuff, but now for the next 20 or 30 years, it just sits there making energy, which is pretty cool. And by the way, people can already buy solar panels and batteries and become completely self-sufficient for about the cost of a car. And if you can do that and then eliminate your energy bills, you might pay for that within 10 or 15 years. So like the economics are pretty freaking clear, even on an individual case with just the little bits of energy that residential homes use. You can buy your way out of grid costs entirely and get a payback pretty quickly. So we're kind of veering off topic a little bit here, but like that's why I just didn't bother explaining that very deeply, except a very surface level. Like, we need to move this direction. I think we're all on the same page. So talking about the rationality of burning gas and why it still, like here in Illinois, depending on most of our grid generation right now is nuclear or gas. We have very little coal left. And so like if you can use the nuclear baseload power, by all means use it. But you know, we don't have, during the day, baseload is not the only thing we're using. So we're kind of close to a tipping point here, but depending on where you are, it's still maybe more rational. But I need to stop talking about this because I've been talking about it for a while. And finally, let me talk about the problems I have with rooftop solar. And you may notice I just brought up an example where people can spend the money and then go off grid, which is cool, except the power grid is the most miraculous machine we have built. You cannot change my opinion on that because I think it's pretty obvious that it is. We have built a machine that reaches virtually everywhere on the continent where people live. And it can move energy silently and efficiently from wherever to wherever, and we can tap into it and do anything we need to for our lives. It is a miraculous machine, and we need to nurture it. There are places where the grid is not resilient, which is purely a political failure. There is no reason the grid cannot be resilient. We just don't spend enough money keeping it up. Which ties into the problem with rooftop solar. So to preface this section, I have no issues at all with the concept of rooftop solar or solar energy. Obviously, we should have more of that because it's very low maintenance, essentially free energy. We just have to put the panels up the one time and then we'll have energy use for 20 years. And yes, go ahead and yell in the comments about, oh, there's raw materials in the panels and like, oh, it's not environmentally harmless to build panels. We know that. We all know that. We are just very confident that that's a lot better for the planet long term than to keep drilling for oil and gas. But anyway, I don't have any issues with the concept of rooftop solar. I just have issues with the way we do it and the inequities that that can perpetuate. So let's get into that. So right now, in most places, in order to incentivize you to install a solar system on your rooftop, you will get, well, I shouldn't say you will because this is changing and that's part of the problem. So most solar systems that you see on people's rooftops are grid-tied solar. They don't have their own local storage. They simply feed the grid. And in the past, this was a very, utilities and governments were both like, hey, we could use some extra generation. You have a rooftop which can generate power if you just slap some solar panels on it. How can we incentivize you to put panels on your rooftop so then we have some generation capacity on the grid and we didn't have to pay for those solar panels? So net metering was born. So net metering, if you think about the old-fashioned power meters that spin, they spin in one direction when you are consuming power, but if you're able to backfeed the grid with your solar production, they'll spin in the other direction. So with net metering, you were only charged for the power that you imported to your home, and any power that you exported would offset that cost. Now, this may sound really fair, but people who have solar panels without any storage, which is the vast majority of the case, they still absolutely rely on the grid. And as a matter of fact, those homes, if the power goes out, their power goes out. You can't have the panels backfeed the grid because that's incredibly dangerous to the linemen that are working on the grid to fix the problem. So we have this issue where we have told people, you can put solar panels on your roof, we will reduce the cost of your energy bill, or even potentially eliminate it if you put enough solar on there, but you still use the grid just as much as any of your neighbors. And sometimes we have rate structures on these plans that make absolutely no sense. My brother, who lives in San Diego, he had solar panels on his home, and he was, I think, forced into a rate plan that basically made using power when you're, well, I should say it disincentivized you from using power when your panels were generating, and then incentivized you to use power overnight. It did really aggressively penalize you if you were going to use power in the afternoons, but it still incentivized shifting demand to the middle of the night when nobody's solar panels do anything. And so a rate structure like that just does not make sense. It's just like you're putting those panels on the roof only to try to offset your cost, and then you're not actually using them to do anything. Now, of course, the power that was exported was used by people in the neighborhood, and like, yay, good. But it's still kind of a perverse incentive to have people operate in that way. It doesn't make any sense. But let's get back to net metering. So the problem with net metering is that you can effectively buy your way out of a power bill. It's not necessarily, I mean, I don't think there's many people who are completely eliminating the cost they pay, but if you are allowed to just buy your way out of that bill, you're gonna be shifting costs from you to your neighbors. And this is already starting to become a problem. I just looked up an article based on California because California, the utilities are starting to try to move away from that net metering structure. And at least there, only 25% of your power bill goes to the cost of generation. 75% is just for grid maintenance and upkeep. So that means if you are getting anything more than a 25% discount on your power bill, all of a sudden you are no longer helping, you're kind of hurting. And that's the thing. I kind of have a fundamental problem with private ownership of grid-tied generation resources because there's no fair way to do this. And every time I can think of a way that would be more fair, it's very thorny. So for instance, what I would prefer is if your utility or someone like that leased your rooftop and said, hey, we want to put solar panels on your roof, we'll give you a discount for doing that. But tons of issues there. There's a lot of predatory crap that has happened from different solar providers doing that very thing, like getting people to sign up for some lease agreement, which then costs them more in the end run. Or even if we do like the most pure thing you can imagine, where it's just like, we'll give you $30 a month to lease your rooftop, we'll own the panels, we'll own all that equipment. Well, then you introduce liabilities like what happens if there's roof damage to that home? What if the installation was botched and now your roof leaks? It's just so thorny. It's so incredibly thorny to find a way to make this equitable and fair and also not start to make the grid more fragile. Because the bottom line is, if you are on the grid and you're not paying for it, or at least you're on the grid and you're able to really shave your costs down to such a degree that the accounting makes you suddenly a cost and not a benefit, it's a disaster for grid reliability, and it's a disaster for equitability, because if that, and that I should say is my core concern, honestly, is that you have to be pretty wealthy to afford solar panels or else get trapped into some sort of a loan to make it work. And the economics are just so hard to play around with, and I don't have a lot of faith that we can fix this. And this is something that I myself am conflicted on, because a rooftop is valuable space that we could be putting solar panels, but also that same solar panel, if it were used on a commercial solar farm, is going to produce more energy, because a fixed solar array on a rooftop is rarely ever ideal, whereas on grid scale, you're going to site them as ideally as you can. You may put them on heliostats. That's generally not the case, but I'm just pointing out that like these bespoke systems, in addition to they create some pretty perverse incentives and inequities, they're also not the most efficient use of a solar panel, and they also might cause long-term accounting issues for the grid, which might cause long-term reliability problems. And truth be told, there's some voices that I follow in the renewable energy scene who, like, I don't think are thinking about this at all, because some like in California, I believe right now they're trying to restructure the net metering system because they're recognizing this is not sustainable. And a lot of people in the renewable energy space are mad at this. They're like, why are we disincentivizing solar? We should be getting everybody to have solar that they can. Well, how do you do that fairly? How do you do that so the people, I guess I should say the only way to do that fairly makes the payback period of solar panels so long that people don't want to do it. We've basically been just over-incentivizing getting people to put panels on their roofs, and it's starting to become a problem already, and it's only going to get worse the more we do this. And then the other thing I haven't even touched on is, if the next thing is, you might go, well, if I'm not going to save any money by installing panels, I'll just disconnect from the grid and go off grid. Okay, I guess that's fair, but like, that's a perfectly valid thing to do if you're in the middle of nowhere and you don't have a grid connection that's reliable. But if you're like, I don't know, if you're anywhere close to urban, even like ex-urban, where you have a reliable grid connection available, but you decide to opt out of it, again, there's another customer on the grid that's been lost. The grid's going to get more expensive the more people do that. So I'm just very concerned about inequities here. I would love to have more solar panels on rooftops because, like I said, it's a big waste of space if you don't do that. But I really cannot think of a way to make this fair and equitable in the long term. And I think that's why we're starting to see these rollbacks on the incentives, because you can't be paying everybody to have solar panels on their roof if their reliance on the grid is still there. And I haven't even talked about the duck curve. That's another huge thing. If everybody's got solar but nobody's got storage, you have this issue where every afternoon generation falls and you have to have all these other peaker plants showing up. So I really think that we need to approach this as a society and not try to push the burden onto individual people. Because, again, talking about inequities, I don't like the idea that cleaning up the grid is up to us. It should be up to us as a collective, but not like, hey, we'll give you a discount if you install solar panels on your roof. I just have a really hard time with that for a lot of different reasons, and that's why I'm not rushing to do it, because it might be nice to lower my power bill, but I'm also just far happier to let the grid be my source of energy. And I think we need to nurture the grid and not do things which might hurt it. It makes a lot of sense to put generation wherever we can put it, but I just cannot figure out a way to make the private ownership of those assets make sense on a societal level. And I mean, like, you could argue that, yeah, all generation equipment now, or most anyway, is private owned. But it's just a real thorn. You can't... I'm not an expert, so, like, I'm sure there are creative ways that we can get this accounting done. But we have that problem where if you do that accounting and you figure out that people's power bills are 75% just grid maintenance and upkeep, then you can't give them a discount more than 25%. Because if you do, literally they are now a cost that their neighbors have to pay for. It's thorny. It's really thorny. So it's one of those things where I think in an ideal world, yes, everybody would have solar on their rooftops. And yes, we would find a way to, have local grid storage or microgrids and stuff. There's all these really cool technologies that I wish I could believe in as far as like a solution. But if it's gonna create the incentives that it's creating now, it's really thorny. So that's honestly why I'm kind of like, no, I'm not going to rush to put solar panels on my roof. It would be nice to do because it could lower emissions. If you could feel good about having those panels on your roof and having completely emission-free power. But the only way to remove your reliance from the grid, or I should say the only way to make that your only source of power, is to disconnect from the grid and have batteries. And every single person who does that makes the grid more fragile, if you see what I'm getting at here. So yeah, to go back to how I started this section, the grid is the most miraculous machine we have ever built. We can throw generation on it however we want. We can do it locally by putting solar panels on the grid. Energy on the grid just flows where it's needed. So if something's pulling energy down, it's going to go that way. But every time we do this and we say, we will let you, the individual, put some generation on the grid that we will then pay for, unless that's done equitably, it's introducing a whole bunch of problems. And it may not even be done sustainably, even if it is equitably. So I hope I did not write a script for this because, and I'm not going to, I'm only going to talk about it here on Connextras, but that's the reason why I'm not pushing anybody to install rooftop solar. We need some serious reimagining of how we can do that. And I'm not even sure that we can do that without harming the grid or harming our neighbors in some other way. It's just, this is one of those things where, like, as much as I think it's really cool to be self-sufficient like that, from a societal standpoint, it's harmful down the road. So yeah, if there were some sort of non-predatory solution where someone could say, hey, we want to use your rooftop for solar panels, we'll give you a small discount on your power bill, but you're still going to need a power bill because you still have to fund the grid, I'd be happier with that. But I still think it's just really thorny. And then the other thing to consider is that, like, commercial buildings, oh, they should absolutely be covered in solar panels. And in that case, the incentives are not that perverse because, a commercial customer, they have completely different tweaks and levers that utility could do for them. Like, every big box store should be covered in solar panels. Every large rooftop should have solar panels on it. There's very little reason to not do it. And then in a commercial environment, you don't have to deal quite so much with those thorny issues, like if there's a roof leak, who pays for it. It tends to be easier to have agreements like that in the commercial setting than in the residential setting. So again, no issues at all with the concept of solar energy or rooftop solar. I just cannot think of a good way to make this equitable and sustainable in the long term. I think the incentives to get some solar on the grid initially made some sense, and subsidizing a small number of households to do that versus all the commercial entities and whatnot on the grid, sure, a drop in the bucket. but every home we add to this mix that has net metering and can buy their way out of the power grid is bringing us closer to disaster as far as making the grid work as one machine for everybody equitably. So that's my piece there. Thanks for watching this rambly video, and I'll see you in part 2, where we will talk about solutions where you don't need to do anything necessarily for rewiring your home. You just have to swap a few things out because those solutions are there. Energy storage and heat pumps are really, really cool. Okay, bye.